Resume recording and off we go. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining the Canadian Celiac Association's Participating in Celiac Research. I am Melissa Secor, the Executive Director of the Canadian Celiac Association and your host for tonight. Our session tonight is generously sponsored by Takeda Pharmaceuticals and Prevention Bio. The Canadian Celiac Association, and fondly known as the CCA, is the national voice for people adversely affected by gluten and is a registered charity. We have 5 key priority areas: increasing access to safe gluten-free food through advocacy and education, improving diagnosis rates and management of the disease through educating the healthcare community, improving quality of life through research and science-based information, generating awareness for a greater understanding of the disease, and finally, strengthening the community through support and resources. Before we start, I would like to just review a few details on how the webinar works in case you are new to online webinars. We have over 200 people registered for the session, so all participants have been muted so that everyone can enjoy the session with minimal disruptions. If you have a question for one of our presenters, please type them in the Q&A box. And type them in as you think of your questions or comments. It's anonymous, so we won't share who's asking the question, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. This session will be recorded, so if you'd like to review any of the material on tonight's session, please feel free to check it out in a few days on our YouTube channel, and I'll show some links later on. If you'd like to chat with the community and post comments, you can use the chat box, which a lot of you are already doing, which is great. So I'd like to call upon Dr. Dawn Dirksen, the chair of the CCA's Professional Advisory Council, to introduce our esteemed speakers tonight. Dawn?
So thanks, Melissa, and I'd also like to welcome everybody to this webinar. I'd like to thank Melissa to start off with for organizing this and for all the things that she does behind the scenes. She really has been galvanizing the CCA, and so there's a lot of activities going on. We had our PAC meeting yesterday. One of the things that the PAC does is administer and adjudicate awards for the J. Campbell Research Awards. So we're involved in research. It's a very important fund to support celiac research in Canada. And so thank you to the CCA for having this fund and for those that contribute to it. We're very fortunate tonight to have 2 of the leading companies that are engaged in active research joining us and sharing their work and telling us a little bit about how the community can help us get closer to potential treatment and cures. Our first speaker is Dan Leffler. Dan is a practicing gastroenterologist caring for patients with celiac disease and other gastrointestinal disorders and is a founding member of the Celiac Center at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. He's an associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School, where he continues to participate in clinical and translational research in celiac disease. He's been the recipient of multiple NIH Foundation industry-sponsored grants for the advancement of digestive health. He's lectured nationally and internationally. He's, in fact, he's given some of the key addresses at the CCA annual meeting in the last few years. He's published over 150 articles in peer-reviewed literature and co-authored a patient-focused book with Melinda Dennis entitled Real Life with Celiac Disease, Troubleshooting and Thriving Gluten-Free, published by the AGA Press. Dr. Leffler joined Takeda Pharmaceuticals in 2016 as a medical director and is the global clinical lead for celiac disease in the gastrointestinal therapeutic area. We're also fortunate to be joined by Dr. Doug Jacobstein, our second speaker. He's a pediatric gastroenterologist and is vice president of clinical development of Prevention Bio, Inc. In his current role, Dr. Jacobstein serves as the clinical lead for Prevention Bio's Phase 2b clinical trial in non-responsive celiac disease. He's been in the pharmaceutical industry for the last 11 years, serving in a variety of positions in research and development and medical affairs, including previous experience at Alba Therapeutics working on celiac disease. Prior to joining Prevention Bio earlier this year, Dr. Jacobstein was director of clinical development at Janssen R&D, focused on therapeutics for inflammatory bowel disease, including Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. He graduated from the University of Maryland School of Medicine, completed his pediatric residency at St. Christopher's Hospital for Children, and completed his fellowship in pediatric gastroenterology and hepatology at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. So we're very fortunate to have both of these speakers with us. I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Dan Leffler to get us started.
Great, thank you so much, Don and Melissa. And maybe the best place to start is just to thank the CCA. For those of you, I'm sure everyone on the line knows this already, but you guys are just, everyone in the celiac community in Canada is incredibly fortunate to have the CCA working with you and for you. They're an incredibly dynamic and really progressive organization, and they've been great partners over the years. So happy to be here and to be able to join today and hopefully clarify and encourage what participation in research for celiac disease is and why it's important. So if we can go to the poll questions, Melissa, if possible. I figured we'd start with some audience participation, assuming enough people are online. And so there's a couple questions. These are all pretty simple, and they go in order. But let's do them first at a time, and I think I'll be able to see how people respond as they come in. But first, it's pretty easy. Do you think celiac disease is an important condition? And then second, do you think we need more research about celiac disease in order to improve diagnosis and treatment? And then three, which is really sort of the kicker question, have you ever participated in a research study on celiac disease? And you can sort of see how the numbers are rounding out right now, and this is universal, so this wasn't meant to make anyone feel guilty if they haven't chosen number three as a yet. But this is universal for many diseases, and celiac disease is no different. And hopefully, what this makes the point of is that really there is a gap, and we see it, we hear it all the time. I hear it in clinic all the time. You know, when are the next breakthroughs going to come? When there's going to be a better test to help me understand if my celiac disease is under control? When is there going to be another treatment to help me get my celiac disease under control if it's not? And really the barrier is right in front of us. We have more sort of momentum now than we've ever had in celiac disease to make real progress. We have tools and techniques in the lab and in the clinic that we couldn't have imagined even 10 years ago. But the barrier to moving this quickly is actually participation. And so, you know, if you take one message home from today, is that it's really important. And actually in my clinic at Harvard, my goal is to always have everyone participate in a research study, down to the last patient walking into clinic. But not all research is the same. And I think that's how we're going to do. So just for a little bit of a preview of how we've decided to organize is that I'll give sort of a more general talk on participation outside of some of the things you might jump to in your mind of, like, you know, participating in a randomized controlled trial of a new treatment, as vital as that is, but give you some of the other ways and really talk a little bit more about participating in research in general, because you know, just like all patients are not the same, not all research studies are the same. And I think there are different opportunities that are right for different people. But no matter where you are in your celiac journey or your family's celiac journey, there really is a role and a way for everyone to participate and help move this field forward. So with that, we'll start off on my slides. And I don't think either of us will talk for a long time. And we'll should have plenty of time for questions at the end. So you can go to the next slide, please. So I thought we'd just start with some basic things that we don't know about celiac disease. And there's a lot, so you can click ahead. So here are some of the main questions that I think about as sort of a clinician practicing, but also as a researcher in celiac disease. You know, what is the benefit of achieving histologic remission? That's healing of the small intestine. And what does that mean anyway? Like, what does healing mean in celiac disease? Is it important to get the celiac blood tests normalized? What's the symptomatic and quality of life burden of people with treated celiac disease, whether they have ongoing symptoms or not? And what are the patterns of healthcare utilization and work and school performance, both pre-diagnosis and post-diagnosis in celiac disease? You can go forward. How many patients who get diagnosed with celiac disease never even start the gluten-free diet. These people are almost universally missing from our studies or quit the gluten-free diet after a while. And what happens to them? Believe it or not, there are people out here who just give up on the gluten-free diet and disappear off the map. I think these are really important, and I worry about them as a clinician, but I don't have a lot of information about what to tell them and what their future is. Go on. So there's also some things that are more about improving quality of care in celiac disease, and you can click forward to just towards the end. But things about what predicts remission and time to remission, and what's the distribution and risk factors for gluten exposure. What are the rates and predictors of quality metrics? So there's a lot of things in celiac disease that we think are important, things like getting a bone density, getting vaccination, seeing a trained, skilled dietitian. But these are very patchy, and we know that some people get them, some people don't. They're better in some communities than others. But we don't know how good the rates are. What are the barriers to getting these things done? And finally, sort of what treatments in addition to the gluten-free diet are beneficial. And this is not just drugs, but it's also, dietary therapies, vitamins, vaccines, behavioral modification. What other things can we do to make lives with celiac disease better? So all important questions. And as you can see, a lot of these are not answered by signing up for a randomized controlled study. A lot of these are answered just by sharing information about your celiac journey with the broader community. You can go on to the next slide. And finally, how do we more efficiently engage patients in clinical research? And I think part of that is what we're doing tonight, but I think there's probably a lot of other ways we can engage with the celiac community, explain what research is all about, and find the right fit of the right research for the right person. Go on to the next, please. So with that in mind, I thought I'd just dispel, hopefully, some myths about medical research. Because to be honest, once you say those words, medical research, it sounds a little scary. And I think that's one of the main reasons that people don't sign up or don't actually proactively look for opportunities, is because the whole thing makes you sound like you're being a guinea pig. And no one wants to be a guinea pig. And so rest assured that no one is. All research studies are really carefully assessed and by a multidisciplinary group before they're allowed to go forward. So one of the most scrutinized things we do in medicine is actually a research study. And whether this is just collecting information or taking a blood sample or a trial with a new medication, there really is a lot of thought and review from people outside the celiac community, from lay people and physicians and ethicists, before any trial is allowed to go forward. There's also, I think sometimes people feel that they're going to sign up for something and then not really understand what they signed up for, or get locked into something that they didn't really understand. And so the first step in any research participation is something called informed consent. That's where you actually read some information, but really discuss with the researcher what the research studies entails. Could be everything from what the risks are, what the potential benefits are, what types of visits you'll need to make, what you'll be asked to do over the course of study. And importantly, this is an ongoing process. So this isn't something that you sign on to at the beginning of the study and then you're sort of locked in and you're not going to get any information. Consent, understood properly, is really an ongoing interactive discussion that should happen every time you see the doctor, every time you have a research visit, if this is an ongoing study. You can go on to the next slide. Thank you. And that feeds into very well to the next one. Once I decide to participate in a clinical trial, you won't be able to change your mind. Again, everything in research is voluntary. You can start and stop anytime you want. However, it's also, we hope, you're making somewhat of a commitment. So if you don't think you'll be able to continue, it's often better just not to start. But that being said, people change, things change in your life, all the time. And so you should know that if you're interested, you don't feel like you're going to be locked in just because you signed on a dotted line somewhere. And finally, being in a clinical trial won't help me. And we have to be very careful on how we discuss benefits of a clinical trial, because a lot of what we do is research, and so we don't know by definition what's going to happen, especially with a new therapy or a new intervention. However, there are some benefits that I think accrue, and most people who have been involved in a clinical trial really speak to, is that you'll be able to be followed more closely than regular, and oftentimes you'll get additional tests and lab work that you wouldn't be able to get as part of usual care. I know in the celiac trials, a lot of them that I run, we offer free celiac genetic testing, so the HLA, DQ2, and DQ8 testing. That is not something that most people have access to. We'll do a more rigorous panel of celiac serologic testing. Again, you'll get, in most trials, all of this information. So that can be a benefit, and that's a significant and real incentive for people to participate. And finally, of course, the altruism. This really is something that you do not just for yourself, but for future generations. And many people who participate in research, be it big studies or small, really report a lot of satisfaction. And I know this from my own experience working with people over the years. Many people, even if it's sort of a long and time-consuming clinical trial, they're almost universally always glad they did it. And go on to the next slide. And a few last ones on myths. Being in a clinical trial is expensive. It isn't covered by medical insurance. This might be more of an American one, but just to make it clear, volunteers in clinical trials almost never have to pay for anything. On the reverse, generally your time and effort for participating in the trial is compensated to some level. And any research care any procedures or tests are always covered by the research study. And finally, I think one of the most pervasive myths is that if there was a clinical trial that was relevant, my doctor would already know about it and tell me about it. And this is unfortunately not the case. Doctors, like everyone else these days, are just really busy, right? And they have to fill out all the documentation and check on a bunch of things. It's very rare that doctors will actually be able to think proactively in the clinic setting about, okay, this person might be relevant for this trial. There might be new trials that come up every day. So unfortunately, until we find better systems, a large amount of the onus for information about clinical trials comes down to the patient community. And fortunately, there are growing easy ways to access clinical trial information. There's clinicaltrials.gov is a great site where almost all clinical trials are listed. In addition, the celiac organizations, the CCA and other organizations will also list clinical trials that are happening, in Canada and in your region, potentially. So, it is something to look out for, whether it's through newsflash or to click on the website every now and again. There are research studies that come and go all the time, and again, all different kinds, from giving a little bit of information, filling out a registry, which I'll talk about in a second, down to, again, participating, hopefully one day, in a trial of a new therapy that could really change people's lives for celiac disease. So it really is something that you have to, right now, be a little bit proactive about to find research studies that are right for you. We can go on. Oh, and a few more. So again, just quickly, because I want to save time for questions, you will not have to give up usual treatments in most cases to join a clinical trial. You can only participate in clinical trial at the medical center where you're being treated at, and that's not true. Oftentimes people move around, and a lot of the travel is covered by the clinical research study. So don't let the fact that your local hospital may not be running that specific study dissuade you. We're really very collegial and collaborative, and I referred patients to other units, other hospitals, other places where they could get into a study regularly, and I know all my colleagues have done the same. And the most important one is at the bottom, of course, is I don't need to participate since other people will. And I think the poll at the beginning maybe addressed that better than anything I can say. But again, this is something that everyone needs to participate in. It's like voting or blood drives or whatnot. You really have to take advantage, and you have to do it yourself if you want the field to move forward. And we really do need to see better participation from the celiac community, which in general is such an engaged and wonderful community to work with. And I think this is we haven't done a good enough job explaining the opportunities and the reasons out there for participating. So you can go on. So I'll just run through very quickly. There are a lot of types of clinical research, and I really do think there is something for everyone. There's registries, and I'll give you some information on a couple of US-based registries, and potentially there'll be a Canadian-based registry, but in the meantime, the US registries are happy to have international participation. You can donate samples, just a blood sample or an extra biopsy if you're having an endoscopy. You can do survey studies, things that can get mailed to you, and actually the CCA's Canadian Celiac Survey, this is done, Don might be able to tell you, good 15 years ago, was really seminal and still one of the most cited papers. It gave incredible value in terms of understanding better what is happening in the celiac community, just because people were willing to fill out a survey and mail it back. And then there's clinical trials, and Doug will talk more about these. But there's a lot of clinical trials beyond the therapeutic interventional ones, which are new drugs, but there's non-interventional trials, there's behavioral trials where you try to change people's behavior and see what happens. There's non-therapeutic interventional trials and interventional trials. So they really run the gamut, and there is no single type of research study, and all of these are important if we want to move the field forward. And if we want to talk about any of these specifically, we can do that later if there's specific questions about some of these differences. So just want to put some information down for the two registries that are local to North America currently. And again, maybe there'll be more. They're both actually good registries and a little bit different. There's a Beyond Celiac Disease has one, the Go Beyond Celiac Registry, and the I Cure Celiac Registry from the Celiac Disease Foundation. And all this will be available online, but I'll just give you a little bit of information about those in the next slides. Next, please. So the Go Beyond Celiac Disease is really more of a narrative registry where you get to really tell your story about your life with celiac disease, how you got diagnosed, your symptoms, life before and after, and what you're looking ahead to. So it really is in many ways an engagement platform as much as a research registry, but has been useful already. And next. And there's a sign up if you're interested to learn more, gobeyondceliacdisease.org. Next slide. And then the I Cure Celiac Registry from Celiac Disease the Celiac Disease Foundation is more of a traditional research registry, allowing you to contribute a lot of information based on surveys. These are validated surveys about celiac disease that are general quality of life surveys. You put in as much or as little of your medical information as you're comfortable with. It's approved by a research council. And it's been used already to generate a number of interesting publications that have, that give us information about what real life with celiac disease outside of what we see in the clinic is really like. We go on to the next slide, and again, these will be available online. But iCureCeliac.org, easy to find, and again, longitudinal if you can do it. It's nice to come back and give your information over time. You go on. So just to give an example of the type of things that have come out of celiac research from registries recently, because I do think registries are a great way to get started with research if you're just sort of feeling the waters a little bit. Here are two studies that were recently published in very good journals just last year. The first one was on the number of patients who are getting diagnosed without a duodenal biopsy, without an intestinal biopsy in recent years. And this is something that is a growing area of interest as people have in general become more comfortable, sometimes we think too comfortable with the blood testing. And now we learned from this that about 20% of people are diagnosed with celiac disease based on blood testing alone, but that people that did not have a biopsy were less likely to see a dietitian and more likely to use treatments that have not been proven to be effective. So that was interesting. There was another study using a similar database looking at the effect of depression on gluten-free diet adherence and symptoms in celiac disease, and showing a interaction between the two that is, I think, changing some of the ways we think about how to counsel people with celiac disease, especially if they have ongoing depression. We could go on. So my last slide, I think, is really just that the take-home message is that celiac disease really needs you. We're really in need of much more rigorous research participation than we've seen. But there's many types of studies, and there's no one right study for everyone. And I think we have the ability to really make huge strides for celiac disease in the coming years, but we can't do it without your help. And so with that, thank you for listening. I'll pass the mic to Dr. Jacobson, and again, look forward to hearing questions at the end.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Leffler. I'm just going to move up to Doug's slides here. And are we good to go, Doug?
Yep, we're good. Great. Thank you very much. And, I want to echo what Dan said. Thanks to Dr. Dirksen and also to Melissa for organizing this. And thanks to all the participants as well on the call. It's not easy to, with everything that goes on in life, to get on a call at 8 o'clock or 7 o'clock or 6 o'clock or 5 o'clock, depending on where you are on the coast in Canada. But I appreciate everyone jumping on the call with us to discuss this. As Dan mentioned, he spent and did a nice job summarizing opportunities to participate in a wide variety of research associated with celiac disease, whether it's registries or participation in clinical trials. There are a vast number of opportunities. And what I thought I'd spend a little bit of time now is talking about the development of particular medications for celiac disease and what's involved in that, because I think whenever we start talking about clinical research, there's always an interest in whether there are therapeutics that could be used in disease intervention and treatment of celiac disease. So next slide. And as part of my disclosures, as mentioned before, I work for Prevention Bio, which is a company that's working on intercepting and preventing autoimmune diseases, and I serve as a clinical lead for a phase 2B trial, which I'll discuss briefly in a few minutes. Next slide. So why should we develop therapeutic for celiac disease, and what would be the interest? Celiac disease is an interesting autoimmune disease in that it's the only autoimmune disease where we know the trigger. And at this point right now, the only treatment for celiac disease involves dietary intervention with a gluten-free diet. And there are no approved non-dietary treatments for celiac disease. So even though the use of the gluten-free diet has been effective, despite best efforts by patients at the gluten-free diet, studies have shown that as little as 50 milligrams per day of gluten can trigger inflammation in the gut. There was a nice study that was done looking at this number and how they came up with it, and they challenged patients for 3 months. They ingested small amounts of gluten, 10 milligrams, 20 milligrams, or 50 milligrams, and they found that approximately 50 milligrams of gluten led to inflammation in the gut. Now, 50 milligrams of gluten, for those who aren't aware, it's really about a crumb size worth of bread. So about a dime size group of crumbs of bread would be about 50 milligrams of gluten. So very, very small amounts of gluten inadvertently ingested per day can trigger inflammation. We also know that gluten contamination in the diet not only leads to inflammation, but it also leads to continued symptoms in patients with celiac disease. And that associated with a gluten-free diet, there is significant patient dissatisfaction with trying to maintain the diet and keeping with the high costs of gluten-free foods. These things add to the burden of a gluten-free diet. Next slide, please. So what supports the interest in the development of a drug for celiac disease? Now, this is an interesting study that was done in 2016 by a group in Chicago, and they took a little over 200 patients with celiac disease and asked them about attitudes regarding the development of drugs. And on the left side of the panel is a group is a question that was asked about cross-contamination. So a drug that would be developed as an adjunct to a gluten-free diet. And on the right panel is a question that was asked about gluten consumption that would replace a gluten-free diet. So if you could take a drug that would replace a gluten-free diet, or would you rather take a drug that would be used as an adjunct to a gluten-free diet? And I think it's interesting, if you look at the both panels combined, what you come away with is that celiac patients in general are very interested in a drug for celiac disease. You can see on the left side that 87% of patients were interested in a drug that would help eliminate cross-contamination as an adjunct to a gluten-free diet. And on the right side, you can see that 65% of patients were interested in a replacement for a gluten-free diet. And so, I think that the take-home message is, and it was a little bit surprising to me, is that actually celiac patients that were interviewed in this study not only preferred any kind of intervention, but actually preferred a drug that would help eliminate cross-contamination rather than as a replacement for the gluten-free diet. Next slide. So this slide is really just an introduction for everyone. I know that in the poll that we started the call with, there are a lot of people who had not participated in clinical research, and that's fine. I think that we have not done, as a group, have not done a great job of offering opportunities to participate. But what I would like to talk now about is what's involved in developing a drug, because I think that if you understand a little bit behind the lingo in clinical trials and how drugs are developed, it may make it easier when opportunities become available to understand what's going on in the clinical trial. So in this slide, you can see moving from left to right across the slide, that drug development starts with pre-discovery. So finding new molecular entities, so compounds that may be active. And in the drug discovery phase, you start out with well over 5,000 compounds in that drug discovery phase. And in order to move forward into preclinical or before it gets to humans, you do approximately 3 to 6 years worth of testing in cell lines and in animals before you can move into the preclinical stage. And from that 5,000 to 10,000 compounds that you start out with, you end up with a much smaller number, about 250 compounds that make it into the preclinical phase. From the preclinical phase, you try and find compounds that you think that work. They may demonstrate some efficacy in a disease in animals or in an animal model. And then those, if they're deemed safe and effective, may make their way into humans. And human clinical trials are divided up into 3 phases through the approval process. The first phase, which is phase 1, is where the drug is tested in healthy volunteers. So you're not taking patients who may have the condition, but you're taking patients who volunteer to be exposed to the drug, and you're making sure that the drug is safe. From that phase 1 study, if the drug is deemed safe, it moves into what's called phase 2. In phase 2, there are, generally speaking, about 2 pieces within phase 2. There's what's called a phase 2A trial, and there's what's called a phase 2B trial. In a phase 2A trial, you're looking at testing the drug in a group of patients who have the disease, but in general, you're using a smaller number of volunteers for the study, somewhere between the orders of anywhere from 50 to maybe 150 patients who have the disorder. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to test perhaps 1 dose or maybe 2 doses compared to a placebo to see if the drug is not only safe, but is it effective. If the drug shows some promise in that phase 2A study, then you move into what's called phase 2B. And in phase 2B, you're looking to define the dose that may be most efficacious. So that phase 2B trial, which could have in the order of 200 to 500 patients, will test multiple dose levels compared to a placebo to see not only is the drug safe and effective, but what is the most effective dose that works and that delivers the best benefits without entertaining a great deal of risk. Once that's determined, then you move into what are called registrational trials. And this is what are deemed the phase 3 trials. And in general, you need somewhere approximating 1,500 patients at a minimum in a phase 3 trial. You can end up with a lot more patients depending on what you're studying, but in general, you need a minimum of about 1,500 patients in those phase 3 studies to go through to get a drug approved or through what's called a registrational trial. In those trials, you're repeating what was done in the phase 2B trial oftentimes, where you're providing the drug at one of a couple doses compared to a placebo, and you're investigating whether that drug, again, is safe and effective. If the drug is successful in that phase 3 program, then you would either submit the drug to whatever regulatory body. Here on the slide, we have FDA review, that would be in the US, or it may go to Health Canada in Canada, or to the European Medicines Agency, which is the European group that reviews applications for drug approval. And then it goes on to large scale manufacturing. And I think a couple things to take away from this slide overall is that, first of all, when you start out on the left side of the slide with 5,000, 10,000 compounds, it quickly, over time, gets cut, and you end up with a single FDA drug based on that 5,000, 10,000 compounds you started with. In addition to that, if you look at the bottom of the slide, you see how long it can take for a drug to be developed. So the preclinical and drug discovery time period may be 3 to 6 years. The clinical trials can take another 6 to 7 years. And for FDA review and approval, it can be anywhere from 9 months to 2 years for approval. And so the bottom line is that there's a large number of compounds that go into drug development. Few come out with an approval, and it can take a long, long time. And so I know that there are that there are patients out there, and you guys have been interested in approved therapies, and as we are, but the time to development can be quite lengthy. Next slide. So I'm going to show you a couple cartoons here in a row, and really the two slides talk about the drugs that are in development for celiac disease, and I don't want to spend a lot of time going through the mechanisms of actions of the drugs. I don't think that that's what's important tonight. We can certainly set up another call, or if there are questions about specific mechanisms of action, we can discuss that. But really the goal here is to show you the excitement that there is in celiac disease. So this slide, this cartoon depicts the drugs that were in development for celiac disease in 2010. And it doesn't take very long to count, but if you look at the green on this slide, you'll see that there are approximately 5 drugs that were in development in 2010 for celiac disease. If you go to the next slide, and this is where I think things get very exciting, you'll recognize quickly that this is as of June of 2019, the number of drugs that are in development for celiac disease has skyrocketed. And so, again, thinking back to the previous slide where there were five agents in development, and looking at this slide now, I think everyone can appreciate the excitement that there is in developing non-dietary therapies for celiac disease. Now, with that comes the understanding that a couple things. One is that not all of these drugs, unfortunately, will make it to approval. But the second thing is that all these trials that are out there will be looking for patients who are interested in participating. And so, I think it's important to keep in mind that I know that that large numbers of you have expressed the need for development of therapies. But when we did the poll, that very few have had the opportunity to participate. So I think on down the line here, there will be very exciting opportunities to participate. Next slide. So I thought it might be useful just to show you an example of a study and go over a few key terms that you may encounter as you consider participation in studies. This happens to be our plan for a phase 2B study for the treatment of celiac disease, a trial that Prevention Bio, the company that I work for, is working on, called ProActive. And the trial is for patients who are not responsive to a gluten-free diet, so non-responsive celiac disease. Perfect, thanks. So the study is a phase 2B study. So if you remember, that's going to be a study that's going to test multiple doses against a placebo. It's a randomized study, which means that patients who qualify for the study will be randomized through a computer system to receive either one of 3 doses of drug or a placebo. And it's double blind, which means that both the patients who participate and the investigators who are doing the study, as well as the sponsor, will not know whether the patient is getting placebo or study drug. In terms of the patients that will go into the study, we're looking at patients who are adults, so 18-year-olds and above, who haven't responded to a gluten-free diet and have symptoms and have indications of their celiac disease and histologic damage associated with the celiac disease. We're hoping to obtain approximately 220 subjects in the study. So you can see, as I mentioned, 3 doses of drug versus a placebo arm, and that the study will run for approximately 6 months. When you participate in a study, there are validated endpoints that are studied. This means that there are you're trying to look at whether the drug is effective at eliminating either signs and symptoms or histologic damage. In our case, the primary endpoint, the main thing that we're looking at is the ability of the drug to alleviate symptoms that are associated with a patient-reported outcome measure called the CED-PRO. So this is a validated patient-reported outcome that measures GI symptoms, among other things. So we're going to focus primarily on GI symptoms, but also look at other symptoms that are associated with celiac disease that are in the celiac disease PRO. In addition to the primary endpoint, we'll also look at inflammation, histology, and safety. We're hoping and planning to start the study in the first half of 2020. We're just working on finishing some chronic toxicology, so some studies in animals to again, validate the safety of the trial before we move forward over. We've done preliminary work and we've done studies for a short period of time in humans with celiac disease, but this toxicology study will allow us to study the drug a little bit longer. As I mentioned, this study is planned to start in the first half of 2020, and more information about participation in the study, if there's interest, can be found through the CCA website as we move forward. It's not up there right now, but it will be up there as we move forward with the study and get closer to launching the trial. And then to close, I think one more slide, Melissa. Thank you. I just want to review what's involved with trial participation, because again, as we saw from the polling that was done before, that there are a lot of participants on the call tonight who haven't been a part of a clinical trial, and so there's a lot of things that are involved in participation in a clinical trial, and I think it's worthwhile to just review sort of a high-level schedule for trial participation so that you understand what's involved when you sign up for a trial. So the first thing is, as Dan mentioned, is informed consent, and that's probably the most important thing when entering a trial, is to review what's involved in the trial with a physician and to understand the risks and benefits that may be associated with the trial. And the informed consent process does just that. It takes you through what's involved in the trial. It takes you through the studies that will be involved in the trial. It talks about some of the risks that have been found and may occur when you participate in the trial. And it talks about some of the benefits that you may have in the trial as well. I think the other thing that Dan mentioned that's important is that any trial participation that takes place, whether you agree to participate in the trial and sign the informed consent, or you go through screening, is that you can opt out at any time. And although we encourage patients to stay in the trial as long as there's no significant risk being entertained, there is always that opportunity for you when you sign up for a trial to remove yourself if either the visits are too extensive or you're having side effects that you're uncomfortable with. There's always that opportunity. So by signing the informed consent, you're not locked into the trial. After the informed consent is signed, patients will go through a screening process. Generally speaking, when you go through a screening process, you're meeting what are called inclusion criteria. So these are the criteria that have been established to participate in the trial, and then making sure that you don't have any of the exclusions that would eliminate you from participating in the trial. In addition, there's oftentimes what we call baseline lab work that's done to make sure that your blood work is in the safe zone to participate. And there also may be, as with our trial, an endoscopy with biopsy, again, to get a baseline reading on the level of inflammation and the degree of damage that's going on in the GI tract before you participate. Once you go through the screening process, there's what's called randomization. As I mentioned, there's a computer-generated system which assigns you to a treatment group within the study. And then there's the study period. And the study period can be anywhere from a couple weeks to, as I mentioned, in our case, 6 months to longer than that. And during that study period, you will be required to either visit your study physician at the site, or in some cases, there may be home visits every couple weeks that are associated with the trial. You may, during that time, receive either placebo medication or the medication itself, depending on which group you've been randomized to. And then there's a whole host of investigations that take place throughout the study. I mentioned electronic data capture. Doesn't necessarily have to be electronic, but in our case, we're using an electronic system to record patient-reported outcome measures, that CED Pro that I mentioned before. So patients at night will fill out essentially a daily diary. There may be lab work that's associated with the trial, and then there may be additional endoscopies performed, one or more. In our case, it would be one at the end of the trial for participation in the trial. And then most importantly, there are safety checks throughout the trial to make sure that you're doing well and that there are no significant adverse events or events that would cause concern that either are related to or unrelated to the study agent in the trial. And so these are all carried out during that study period. And then finally, there's a safety follow-up period. And during that safety follow-up period, you may no longer receive study medication or placebo, but you're just checked to make sure that things are still going well and that, that there's no sequelae from either being exposed to placebo or to the drug, and to make sure that, that you're still doing well. And so that's overall kind of a high-level view of trial participation. And with that, I think that may be the last slide that I have. I'll stop, and I think there may be, I'm looking at the chat that's going on, and I see that there are lots of questions that may have come up. So with that, I'll pause and see if there's questions that we can answer for you.
Yeah, I would just say just another way, there's been a lot of great questions on the chat. Not all of them have made it into the Q&A. So Melissa, I just want to make sure you're aware. I'm not sure how you want to toggle between the two.
All right. Well, we'll see if we can manage and just being mindful of our time. But it sounds like we've. I hope maybe we may have to go just a little over time because it's been a very active group and with lots of questions. So thank you both for a very informative chat. And just want to remind everybody that we are recording tonight's webinar. So you know, watch our YouTube channel for the recording to share with your friends and family, or just to watch again if you've missed anything. We've got a number of interesting videos and webinars on our channel, including our recent State of Celiac Disease, which Dr. Dan Leffler participated as a panelist, and Dr. Jacob Stein participated as part of the one of the leaders, and certainly Dr. Don Dirksen did as well. And we were pleased to bring a lot of North American experts talking about the very research that is sort of happening in and around North America and the world. So. All right, so, and I just, because I might lose some people by the time we get into questions, I just want to just mention that CCA, remind people CCA is a national charity, and in order for us to continue offering the education, the advocacy, events like tonight, investments in research, where we want to maybe see a treatment and a cure, we're heavily rely on donations. So if you've enjoyed tonight's webinar and presentation, we encourage you to donate to the CCA by visiting our website at celiac.ca and click the donate button. And we also have an evaluation that you'll see as well to offer ways to improve the webinars, but also suggest some new topics for future presentations. So on to our questions here. So someone's just asked, I think you covered it, Dan, but how can we volunteer to participate in celiac research? I think you basically suggested that people either look at the patient registries. They may be contacted through there or through, groups like ourselves. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. So the CCA is a great resource for opportunities like they are for so many other things. Also, the site I mentioned, clinicaltrials.gov, it is a U.S. site theoretically run by the NIH and FDA, but almost every site worldwide, almost every study worldwide will be listed there. It's sort of the main database for research studies. So just because it has a U.S. sort of URL address, it really is an international site and probably the single most extensive, although not always the easiest to search.
Okay. So I've got a question about the blood DNA testing that is mentioned during your MIST discussion. Does this work differently than the standard celiac blood test used for diagnosis? If so, how does it work effectively on a celiac patient? Would have been gluten-free for probably a long time. If it can work in these situations, then why is it not used as a test for all people with as a test for people with having health issues? I don't know if I'm making sense here. So I guess they're looking at DNA testing.
Right.
Yeah,
that was the DNA testing. So it doesn't change. It doesn't diagnose celiac disease, but it tells you which of the genes you carry that are predisposing to celiac disease, which ones you might pass on. It can also, I think there's increasing evidence that it can tell you something about your sensitivity to gluten, and that not all celiac disease is the same. So it is, I think, a useful test that people benefit from knowing.
Okay. Another question, you mentioned about I don't know if it was Doug or yourself, but did the patients who ingested between the 10 and 50 milligrams of gluten experience symptoms? If not, how were researchers aware of any gut inflammation?
Yeah, so interesting. Thanks for the question, Jackie. So in that study, actually, interestingly, they did not all experience symptoms. So they performed endoscopy at the beginning and endoscopy at the end to look for the gut inflammation, and found that there really was, in this study, very little correlation between inflammation and symptoms, despite this ingestion of gluten. So.
Are all of these studies done on adults only? Actually, that was one of my questions. Do you ever study children?
Yeah, so, and that's a good question as well. We didn't, that's a slide that I went through that talked about a drug approval stops before pediatric studies. So this has actually become a very hot button topic within the drug development space and with the regulatory agencies. Clearly, there's a need for drugs in the pediatric population as well. And there have been a lot of different ways to address that, either starting earlier in kids, or what's done more often now is actually adding adolescents, so kids 12 to 18 or to 17, in some of the adult trials when they get into phase 3 is one way that that companies have started addressing the need for early development. Again, there are some ethical issues with testing drugs on kids before it's been proven safe in adults. I don't want to go into too much detail about that, obviously, but you can imagine that parents oftentimes want to make sure that the drug's safe before they enroll young kids in a clinical trial. But there are opportunities for adolescents to participate in adult trials, and I think that as we move forward, there will be this requirement and there will be this interest to continue to add adolescents into adult trials much sooner as in the drug development process.
As researchers, do you find that when patients go under a clinical trial, do they start changing habits? And from a research perspective, do you want people just to keep being them, or?
So this is just an absolutely fantastic question, and it's probably, if you look historically at the last few drugs that have not successfully demonstrated efficacy, what's been found in those trials has been that unfortunately some of the reasons why they haven't worked has been because patients have changed their behavior when they've entered the trial. There's a description that's called the Hawthorne effect, which is a fancy term for basically saying that patients have changed their behavior when they've entered the trial. And essentially what happens is by doing that is that things that you may have found, so if there were differences between the drug and a placebo, for instance, because everyone's doing the same thing in the case of celiac trials, if you want patients to continue on whatever diet they're on coming into the trial and they modify their behavior, then it affects the outcome of the trial. And so it's very important that, to answer your question, that when you enter a trial, that you continue to do the same behavior that you're counseled to do when you enter the trial. So that's a great question.
Okay. What percentage of people don't improve with a gluten-free diet?
I was hoping we would get to this one. So this was really interesting, and so many of the chat comments were back and forth about who's healing, who's not, the time it takes to heal. So I'd say two things. We believe about 25% of patients don't have adequate control of celiac disease despite a gluten-free diet. And that's due to some combination of, it's too much gluten exposure drives most of it. It's not, 95% of that is due to too much gluten exposure. But for some people, that means, they're really just getting more than they should get. For some people, that means they are so sensitive that the little bits of environmental contamination that are impossible to avoid are still too much for their system. And so there are a lot of people out there that are not doing well enough on a gluten-free diet. And again, that's who we're targeting, as Doug said, in most of this research, is if you're doing fine, your blood tests are normal, your symptoms are under control, you have intestinal healing on the gluten-free diet, then you're certainly probably not at the highest need for a new therapy. But for a large proportion of the population, of the celiac population, and unacceptably large, that's not the case. The other thing I would say that came up a lot is how long it takes to heal. And I think this is something that I could read a lot of sort of frustration with going on the chat, and I think it's completely appropriate to be frustrated. I mean, if you think of another disease, if you came with a bad rash to your physician and he said, put this cream on 5 times a day and it'll probably get better in 5 years, you'd probably be looking for another doctor. But that's our standard in celiac disease, and I think we can do better than that we should be able to do better than that. And that's, I think, really the promise of some of these additive therapies above and beyond the diet.
We have an interesting question. Someone saying their symptoms are they're asymptomatic. And so he's, can I assume that with cross-contamination, I still have inflammation? I guess as researchers, is symptomology something you're trying to solve, or is it just the inflammation, or is it both? I think that was kind of brought up in Paris during some of the discussions.
Yeah, so I think it's both. I think, ideally, they need to go hand in hand. I think is the simple way to look at it. Clearly, if we just treat the symptoms but don't treat the inflammation, then there will likely be sequelae down the road, and vice versa. Healing the inflammation likely will hopefully take care of some of the symptoms. But if you still have significant symptoms, it probably doesn't matter to you because you feel so awful all the time that the inflammation is better. So I think that the need is to have something that can affect both.
And is it trickier, I guess, as researchers, if someone is asymptomatic, but they're still having that gut inflammation? It's hard for them, I guess, as they're recording, well, I'm not feeling any different, but maybe they are healing. But how do you tell?
Yeah, so I think for the first, they are challenging, and I think that has come up in many different situations. I think for the initial trials where we really have to show a drug is helping people, we're probably going to be restricted to people who have both ongoing symptoms that we can measure improvement and ongoing intestinal damage that we can follow. But I think if we find something that's proven to be safe and effective in that population, to me, one of the next obvious steps would be to look for people who have atypical or minimal symptoms but still have worrying degrees of intestinal damage and see if we can make that better, because I think that is likely to improve long-term health.
Someone's asking about clinical trial sites in Canada.
So, yeah, so that's a good question. And you know, I think Dan had said, you know, clinicaltrials.gov in the US oftentimes will list the clinical sites in Canada. Certainly, in our case, for prevention, we are planning the trial in Canada as well as the US and in Europe. And the sites will become available, I think, a combination of ways, obviously through our own website, but also through the CCA as well, is probably the best way to do it. And then the clinicaltrials.gov site in the US will also should have the sites both in the US and outside. So.
Okay. Someone's asking any plans to do drugs that could help with interaction between celiac and microscopic colitis. So I guess, you know, other conditions besides celiac helping another condition.
Yeah, so I mean, I think comorbidities, this has come up in a couple of different ways over time. And I think it's always something we think very carefully about, is which other comorbidities to exclude because they make the trials too complicated to interpret, and which ones we should include because treatment, better control of celiac disease could improve that condition as well. I think, you know, type 1 diabetes is a good example that if you improve the celiac disease control, you often improve the diabetes control. So microscopic colitis is a good one where there's often so much overlap that I think that is something that will likely need to be studied. And then, you know, once we have a better handle on a drug, is, you know, how much of its microscopic colitis symptoms we can improve just by better control of gut inflammation, sort of more globally.
Okay. How often should a celiac teen and adult have blood work? What should be tested? Endoscopy, any other regular tests? I'm not sure if this is to do specific research or just generally just checking their TTG levels. So.
Yeah, so I mean, just quickly, so the current recommendations are that you should have your blood tests done, celiac serologies done every year or two, more frequently when you're just diagnosed, so usually a couple times in the first year and then, you know, every year or two indefinitely. Endoscopy is a little less clear, but certainly many guidelines at least recommend a one follow-up endoscopy. The timing varies a few years out to show that there's been healing or improvement at least. But the timing and how often this gets done and the value of that, especially when there's nothing else to do besides tell people to continue on the gluten-free diet, is a little unclear. But I do think everyone clearly deserves to be followed by a gastroenterologist who is knowledgeable about celiac disease and by a dietitian who is knowledgeable about celiac disease, who can then individualize sort of surveillance and options.
Okay. Any other questions? I know we're just kind of hitting kind of the wall on time, but Dan or Doug, is there anything in terms of that you saw maybe in the chat box you want to address that maybe didn't pop up in the Q&A box?
No, I think
we hit a lot of the main ones. I don't know
yeah.
what the, you know, stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. All right, good. Well, thanks everybody for a really robust chat and Q&A time, and thanks very much to our speakers for joining us tonight and you know, really kind of giving us a nice overview of celiac disease and research. And I think there's definitely, as Doug mentioned, there's some opportunity to maybe have another webinar to kind of review some of the, you know, research that is going on and kind of the way different groups are kind of trying to tackle the potential kind of cures and treatments that are out there. It's exciting to see a lot happening in the area, the explosion between just a few to quite a number, because I think that's been a frustration for the community over the years in terms of, you know, who is working on this? Well, it looks like a lot of people are, so that's great news for the community, and glad that CCA can be a part of bringing patients, making them aware of studies, and being a part of, potentially maybe a future Canadian registry to make sure we've got lots of people to participate who want to. So I want to thank our great panelists and thank Dr. Dirksen for joining us as well tonight. And please, everyone, be aware that we do have a survey that is coming your way, through your inbox tomorrow, and let us know how you enjoyed this evening tonight and what future topics you'd like to see. And again, encourage you to support the CCA to continue the work that we're doing on your behalf, because there's still a lot to go in terms of, finding a cure and managing treatments and quality of life. So we want to be a part of that journey to help you feel better. So thanks, everyone, and hope you have a great evening.
Thank you all.
I appreciate it.
Thanks very much. Take care.
Thanks, Melissa and panel.